to make sure I'm not relying on any false premises, I have some clarifications and questions, and I know how you support clarifications and asking questions, so let's get started. Why do you cite, quote, and refer to the Constitution, court cases, due process, rules like Brady request and prosecutorial misconduct, and legal doctrines in your videos and court filings?
Well, I want to just make something clear, too, because I have a clarification because I don't want to waste any more time than is necessary. Are you covering any new ground with this political issue argument? Or is it the same thing that we've already discussed before multiple times?
We have never discussed the political doctrine issue at all.
We've done that in text, so you're wrong about that. We have. And I've addressed the issue many times on my show. So are you raising the same issue? We did this on my forum. Are you raising the same issue that it's a political issue that you've raised in the past that we've discussed, whether it's audio or text?
Well, we've never texted, we've never audioed anything about the political question doctrine. So maybe we'll get to that tonight. Maybe we won't. But I believe, reading the comments, I believe Misty has made you aware of the doctrine and quoted some cases regarding it. And this is information that I really have not gotten into with you at any point in time. So I don't think you could say it's my same old arguments because I've never had one on this issue with you.
You didn't discuss this with me on the forum before?
No.
Okay, well, I'll post screen caps of that in the video just because I don't think you're right there. But I've discussed this with you on the forum at length. I've even done videos on this and quoted you from the forum, and I've done that on the show. So I have addressed your issue before, and I know that Misty every week keeps, so it's not a new argument. And so if you don't think that you've argued it before, fine, I'll still address it. So
okay.
Your question was,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Your question was, do I cite the Constitution and Due Process Clause on the show and in paperwork? Was that what you asked me?
No. I asked you, why do you cite, quote, and refer to Constitution, court cases, due process rules like Brady request, prosecutorial misconduct, and legal doctrines in your videos and court filings? Why do you do that?
To show that it's not only unfair according to basic principles of right and wrong, it's unfair even by their own rules.
So it's because these are rules that they have to follow. Is that correct?
Those are rules that they presumably are supposed to follow.
And you recognize that because you cite them. Okay. Do you agree that the legislative branch passes laws which say to whom they apply and how they are to be enforced?
I would agree with that generally, yes.
Okay. Do you agree that the executive branch enforces said laws?
That's presumably, yes. That's what they're supposed to do.
Do you agree that the legislative branch creates the foundation upon which a court's jurisdiction is based?
I believe that's part of it. I believe that they also base it off of the Constitution, which isn't necessarily written by a legislature.
Okay.
And I have another clarifying question, okay? And this is something I've brought out in videos. So, do you believe that the government, the federal government, and the state and local governments, as they're supposed to operate under their constitutions, are legitimate moral organizations?
I am not here to discuss your views on political philosophy or the philosophy of moralities. I'm here to discuss what 90% of your output is, and that is people in traffic court at arraignment and how to deal with judges and such prosecutors. That's what this discussion is about, and that's what the topics you were informed of. So, given the facts that the legislative branch creates the foundation of the court's jurisdiction, given those facts, what evidence would prove that the legislative branch has, in fact, created the foundation of a court's jurisdiction?
Well, I disagree with the premise of the question because the Constitution is what forms the basis of the court's jurisdiction, given that every, like Article 3, and for example, in the federal Constitution. So the court's jurisdiction is not always set. It's initially set by the judicial power section of the Constitution, and then there may be additional jurisdiction given as far as what the legislature does. But the thing is, when I am going into court, what you say is 90% of what we're talking about is we're pointing out that what they're doing is unfair and that the proceeding itself is unfair. And in that context, it is a relevant question as to whether the organization that we're talking about is a moral and ethical organization or it is not a moral and ethical organization. Because I don't think it's fair, and maybe you'll agree with this, that if we're going to judge the fairness of an organization's actions, we can't just limit the analysis to just the rules of that organization. I mean, that would be like judging the mafia and whether they're a legitimate moral organization based on just their rules. So I don't think it's an irrelevant question. I think it goes right to the work that I do that you want to criticize here, which is fine. But I think that's an issue that is relevant and needs to be addressed. So you need to answer, is the government, federal, state, and local, as constituted by their constitutions, are they moral and valid organizations?
Well, I'll tell you what, for a guy that makes a lot of videos and rants and raves about being accused of talking philosophy instead of law, here we are in a discussion about law, court decisions, and legal proceedings at a traffic court arraignment, and you're bringing in the philosophy of morality. We're not here to discuss philosophy. You're not here to discuss what you think, what you believe. I'm asking you about your process, what you do, what you talk about 90% of the time in your videos, and that's what I'm here for, and you were informed of that. So your philosophy of the morality of government and Lysander Spooner's, his ideas and those things, they're not relevant to this discussion. If you want to have a political philosophy discussion at a later date, we can do that. That's not what we are here for today. So I'll ask you once again, given the facts that the legislature creates the foundation of a court's jurisdiction at the state level, at the lower courts are created by the legislature, and those are traffic courts. Given those facts, what evidence would prove that the legislative branch has in fact created the foundation of a court's jurisdiction?
Well, first of all, I'm not ranting and raving, and you're the one who sounds like he's getting a bit irritated here. So maybe you're the one who's going to go apoplectic, to borrow the phrase from you. But let's get to I understood, and I know what the issues are. However, there are relevant issues that go to that point of jurisdiction. I'm not asking you a philosophical question. I'm asking you a matter of, are they a criminal organization? Basically, in plain English, are they a legitimate organization or are they a criminal organization? And that you can't avoid that analysis or that answer and then be able to discuss whether what I'm doing in court and pointing out whether they're right and wrong and whether it's unfair or not. We can't discuss whether the proceedings are fair or unfair in the way I do things without first addressing whether they are a criminal organization or not. So you can throw out whether it's philosophy or okay, but that doesn't address the key issue here. We cannot have a discussion on whether the proceeding itself is fair if we're only going to examine the rules put out by that organization. So you can bail if you want. But this is a relevant part of the discussion. Is the government the one who are conducting these so-called trials and are creating these rules? Is it a legitimate moral institution? Yes or no? Did he bail?
I'm not going to sit here and discuss your political philosophy or what is right and wrong. We're here to discuss the topics that you agreed to, and that is jurisdiction, prima facie, as it applies to the arraignment. And if we get to it, we'll get to the point of where asking whether the law applies just because you're in a physical location is a political issue or not. We can get to that later, but let's continue. Will you please answer the question on the subjects that we agreed to, and that is jurisdiction for one thing, and here it is. Given the facts that the legislature creates the lower courts like a traffic court and such, what evidence would prove that the legislative branch has in fact created the foundation of said court's jurisdiction?
Look, you're trying to mischaracterize it as talking about my political philosophy, and I'm not doing that. I'm asking you for what you believe. Do you believe that it is an ethical organization so that we can then examine the rules that that organization is making so that we can come to have a rational adult discussion as to whether the proceedings in the traffic court are fair? So don't put it in terms of my political philosophy. I'm not asking you. I'm asking if you believe it is a moral or legitimate organization so that we can then have an intelligent discussion on the rules and the proceedings and if they're fair or not. Because that's what I talk about 90% of the time. So are you going to answer that so that we can proceed, or are you not going to do that? If you're going to refuse, I'll still participate with you. Okay, but you could just say, I'm not going to tell you what I think of the government as being moral or not. But don't couch it in terms that I'm asking for my political philosophy, because that's not what I'm doing. So yes or no, is it a moral institution, or are you going to refuse to answer the question?
I told you I'm not here to discuss political philosophy of any kind, nor any type of philosophy on morality. I'm here to discuss the procedures of court that you talk about, the things that you file, what you do, how you tell people to do things, the type of paperwork you give them to file in court, the things you tell them to say in court, the things you tell them that are true about the proceedings. I'm here to discuss those things. You know that. You agreed to it. Let's move on.
Now, you have to know that is what underlies what I'm doing. The reason why we're doing it is to point out it's not fair, not necessarily and only because of their rules, but by basic principles of right and wrong. What the Supreme Court would say, traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. So it's kind of disingenuous of you to not answer the question when I'm just asking you a basic question, because even the Supreme Court talks about basic principles of justice, and it was the international shoe case. So don't go throwing this whole thing about philosophy. That's just a way of dodging the question. So you want to dodge a question? Fine. I'm used to you doing that. We'll get to the rest of the discussion.
Good. Let's move on. Given the facts that the legislature creates the lower courts and creates their foundation of their jurisdiction, what evidence would prove that the legislative branch has in fact created the foundation of a court's jurisdiction?
Well, the evidence is, because I just told you, it still comes and is still entirely based on let's say for the federal court, it would be Article 3, the judicial power, the granted judicial power, and then the power of the legislature to then create other courts is still based on the Constitution, is it not?
Okay, thank you. So the deal is the jurisdiction that the court refers to when you ask it if there's evidence of jurisdiction is this jurisdiction we're talking about that has been authorized by the legislature, which represents the overwhelming power of the sovereign. Now, evidence of this jurisdiction is the fact that there is a law granting the court the ability to hear legal disputes, cases of controversy, for instance. That's why the judge always refers to the law as evidence when asked if a jurisdictional question.
Was there a question for me?
Yeah, I'm having a error here. I'm sorry. Give me a minute. Okay, so do you have any relevant authoritative evidence, such as a traffic case, that addresses the court's jurisdiction?
I have posted responses from prosecutors and judges that point out it is the Constitution, a certain section of the Constitution, that they rely on for their assertion of jurisdiction.
Well, I have a case that was one of your students, Leeson. And that case went to she lost, of course, and she appealed it to the appeals court. And they addressed that issue of jurisdiction. And they never once mentioned the Constitution. They mentioned the statute that the legislature had passed as evidence that the court had jurisdiction. Now, do you have a case that says something like that about a traffic ticket case?
Yeah, I have to post it on my website. No, I didn't. I love how you throw, and it was, she lost, of course. You don't need to take, let's try to be adults here. You don't need to inject such negativity into the conversation. I've extended you that courtesy, and maybe, you're adult enough, you can extend that to me. You don't have to take shots like that. I don't have them off the top of my head because honestly, I thought this was a complete waste of my time, and I did not go and start pulling the cases. The only thing I did as far as prepping is to get something that one of your friends posted, Luther versus Borden, which I'm sure is one of the ones you may want to cite. What I can tell you is that the prosecution and the cop are alleging, and I have calls from prosecutors to actually prove this. They are alleging that their claim of jurisdiction is that if I'm physically in Arizona, the Constitution and laws apply. And that is what we're actually attacking and challenging when we go to court. Okay, so first get that part right. The challenge is to the cop or prosecutor's legal claim that because I'm physically in Arizona, the laws apply. And that's something I went through with the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court. And if you watch that video, he agrees. I know you have a different opinion on why he's doing that, but he does agree, and they all agree every time I speak to them. So I have direct testimony and statements that I have from prosecutors and judges. I also have, if you look on the success stories and the articles, I do post, when I have them, documents from prosecutors and judges that it is based on the Constitution. Some will say it's a certain statute. Yeah, no question about that. But the statute, as far as I understand, the statute only has validity and applies if the Constitution does. I mean, when you agree with that the Constitution is a supreme law of the land, if the Constitution doesn't apply, the statute is not even relevant?
The Constitution, the one you talk about being the supreme law of the land, only applies to government and government people, doesn't apply to the non-government individual, unless you can quote me a section in the United States Constitution where it restricts or limits an individual's liberty.
You're going to tell me the taxing power, it does not restrict individual liberty? The taxing power has nothing to do with with private people?
I asked you to quote me a section where it says and specifically sets out any restriction or limitations on an individual's liberty, and you went to the taxing issue, which is a political issue, of course. So let's move on. I see where you're going. So,
because I'm making
just a second, along this same vein, do you have any legal authoritative evidence that says a prosecutor has to provide evidence that the law applies beyond providing the statute in question and relevant fact circumstances? Do you have any quote, any evidence, any court case, any legal authoritative source that says they've got to provide something beyond the statute in question and the relevant fact circumstances.
So you're just going to blow past my question. You're not going to answer it, right? It's because you just don't want to go there. So whether the statute is relevant to even be discussing if the Constitution does or does not apply, you're not even going to address that. You're just going to blow past that, right? That's what you want to do. I want to be clear. I don't want people listening to this to be clear. You're not going to address that question, right?
I'll address it right now.
Okay.
Whether the Constitution applies or whether a law applies is a political question. Why is it a political question? Because the legislature, which is an elected branch of government, that's called the political branch, just like the governor is a political branch because he's elected. And the elected legislature, their job is they create laws, they tell to whom it applies, and to how it's to be enforced. I mean, on November 27th, you had a caller that called in. He said he had been researching this stuff, and he found out that the legislature is the one that decides to whom the law applies and how it's to be enforced, and the courts have nothing to do with it. And boy, you just scooted away from that real quick. That's the problem. That question in that form is a political question.
I addressed this with you on my show directly, so you're not. I don't know. You said you're considerably older than me. I don't know if that's it, but we discussed this in minute detail on the show, and so I asked you directly when the police officer says that, and he answers the question, and he testifies or he answers my question that he determined the laws apply because he saw me physically in Arizona. You have no problem saying that that's a legal claim. But, and this goes back also to the forum, but when I don't accept his answer, which is non-responsive, you say then I'm asking a philosophical question. And I disagree. So when a police officer testifies in court that the laws apply because I'm physically in Arizona, he's making a philosophical statement?
No.
But when I question it, it suddenly becomes political, right?
No, it's the form, or it's what you're thinking. You see, you're confusing what I say and what I mean. A legal claim that you talk about all the time simply means that there is a law on the book somewhere that defines this particular activity and to whom it applies and how it's to be enforced. That's a legal claim, if you will. A political claim is one that goes to the exercise of sovereign power, like taxation or the enforcement of laws. So, yeah, once you say, and that federal magistrate judge told you this very thing in that interview you've got posted. He told you that if you're asking, does the law apply just because I'm here, then that's not enough for you. And you're saying, well, no, I don't think it does. And he said, well, that's a political issue that you can't take into court. And that's what I'm saying. When you say, does the law apply to me just because I'm in this physical location, that is not a legal question. That's a political question.
The federal judge, John Buttrick, also said that the application of federal law was largely arbitrary. So, that's also a takeaway, one of the bigger takeaways from that interview. However, we're talking about a tax agent, or let's say here a traffic court, where a police officer is making a claim. Let's not even put a stripe on it, okay? Don't even describe it. The police officer is saying, and prosecutors, do the same thing. He's physically in Arizona, the laws apply, and that's the basis of personal jurisdiction. Now, is that claim is made in court? And I challenge the prosecution or the police officer, and I ask him for the facts to prove that to prove his claim that just because I'm physically in Arizona, to prove that the Constitution, a written instrument, actually applies. And when I question it that way, you're saying that turns there. When I question it in that way, you're saying that even though they're not making a political claim, they're just making a legal claim, that my questioning it is a philosophical issue.
No, what I'm saying is the claim that he's making is based on the law governing that situation. So that's all the enforcement branch can do. They look at it and they say, okay, there's a law. It says to whom it applies and how it's violated and how to enforce it. So from that standpoint, from his opinion, in his belief, in his scope of his duties, yes, the law applies to you.
You're taking a very narrow scope and you're ignoring the fact that I am dealing with actual prosecutors, tax agents, tax lawyers, tax counsel, like with my franchise tax board, there was a tax counsel. You're trying to leave out the fact that they are in fact making a decision that if I'm physically in Arizona or California, whatever it is, then the Constitution, their supreme law, applies, and that is what is given them the basis to apply their laws and give jurisdiction. You cannot take the Constitution out of this situation when I have too many examples of tax agents and bureaucrats of all stripes all saying that's what their claim is. Now, if you disagreeing, sir, with what these cops and prosecutors and judges and tax agents, your disagreement that that's not what they're actually claiming is not relevant to the discussion. You have to deal with the claims that are actually being made by these agents. Now, you can go call them if you want, and you can say, you are not arguing right. This has nothing to do with the Constitution. Your job is just to apply the statute. You're welcome to go do that. But I'm dealing with people who are actually making these claims, and then I'm dealing with the claims that they're making. So you thinking that they're making, you're disagreeing with that is completely irrelevant to the discussion. You have to deal with the actual arguments that these agents are making in the real world. Right? I mean, isn't that what we should be talking about? Not what the way you think it should be?
No, you're here again. You're misunderstanding what I'm saying. All these people you're talking about, when they say the Constitution and law applies to you, period, zero, they're saying that because at their level, they have to, that's all they can look at to justify what they do. Is there a law? Is it constitutional? Does it have whom it applies to and how it's to be enforced? If they look at that and they see all that information, they don't look beyond that. You're trying to look beyond it and saying that they have to come up with something else. I mean, do you have any legal authoritative evidence that says the foundation of a legal claim is whether the law applies to you just because of your physical location? Or is that a foundation of a political claim? Because a legal claims foundation is the fact that there is a law governing the allegations. And so if you ask them, does this apply? Can you prove this applies to me? Yes. They point to the law and says, the law says it applies to you. They don't have to tell you, or they may not even think in terms that I think in, because they're focused on their job and their jurisdiction, their job duties. And their job duties is to follow the law. And if the law says it applies to you, in their opinion, in their belief, with their firsthand knowledge of reading the law, they will say it applies to you, period. Unless you can come up with some evidence that says, no, this law doesn't apply to me because here is a judge that interpreted it and said it didn't apply to me, or here's another law that says it doesn't apply to me, or that law is been repealed. Those are your only defenses.
So you just want to claim that I don't understand, and you completely ignore the substance and the facts that I lay out. I have on record more than a few police officers, prosecutors, judges tax agents. I speak to these people all the time. All the time. I'm telling you, and I have the evidence on my website, but you ignore it. It doesn't matter what you think they should be arguing. I'm telling you, in the real world, at least the one I inhabit and the people that I'm talking to, they are unanimous. I do it the same way every time, sir. Every time. I get a clarifying question so I know exactly what their argument is. And it's the same one every single time. If I'm physically in Arizona, the constitutional laws apply. They agree that their decision that the laws apply is based on that I'm physically in Arizona, and that means the Constitution applies. You don't want to address that is actually what these people are saying. And that's fine for our discussion. I think people can just hear that this is yet I think the third or fourth issue that you just will not address directly. These are the arguments and the claims that are being made. And that's why I challenge those. And you instead want to go around that and say, well, they're not supposed to be doing that. They're limited to this. But in practice, that's not what they're doing, sir. So do you want to address the fact that it's practically unanimous that is the claim that they're actually making? I mean, I'm not going to go through the time, and I could pull up the phone call with that tax agent and you could hear it, but I don't think it'll make a dent. Nothing seems to affect you whatsoever. Mark is wrong, and the facts be damned. So are you going to address the fact that this is what the prosecutors, police officers, and tax agents are actually claiming, or are you going to ignore it?
No, you didn't hear me.
Again.
I told you that's exactly what they say, and I told you why they say it. Now, why couldn't you hear that? I said it in English. You try to ignore it. You keep bouncing back to, I've talked to all these people on the phone, so, and I interpret what they're saying this way. So, this is the way it really is. I'm telling you that in their job duties and their description and what they're bound by, of course, they will always say the Constitution and law applies because that's what the law tells them. And they can't go any further than that. So of course, Mark, hear me now. They will always say that.
Yeah, you can't go one line without throwing out an insult, can you? I said it in English. I heard you, and I heard that you didn't actually address the issue. So if they're making that claim, why can't I challenge it in court? Why don't they have to prove it in court? And this again gets to my statement before that you didn't want to address. When we're going to be discussing whether the proceedings are fair, we cannot use only their rules. So is it fair for them to make a claim against me in court that I cannot challenge? So maybe, can I get a yes or a no from that? Is it fair for them to make a foundational claim against me that I cannot challenge?
Okay. All they have to answer you by is by giving, as far as evidence that you want evidence that applies, the only evidence that they're required or that they can even look to is there the law written on the books that says this certain thing, and has that law been upheld as constitutional? That's all they have to look at. They don't have to look at anything else. That's what you're missing. You're going off into the weeds, and all they have to say and produce evidence for you that the law applies to your situation is the statute passed by the legislature that says this is who the law applies to and this is how you enforce it, and they have to follow that.
I'm going to ask the question again. If you could just indulge me for a second. Yes or no? Is it fair for them to make a claim against me that I cannot challenge?
You can challenge it if you can prove that law has been repealed, that law, you're not one of the people that it says it applies to. If you can prove that you're not, that it doesn't have an enforced mechanism, if you can prove that the statute of limitations is expired, if you can prove all those things, yeah, you have plenty of defenses just unfortunately, you probably really don't.
Okay, one last time, just yes or no. Answer the question. I don't want a dissertation from you. Okay, I don't want you to just let's try to get 1 point at a time, sir. Okay, yes or no. Is it fair for the prosecution to make a claim that I cannot challenge?
I just told you ways you could challenge it.
Can you give me a yes or no answer to that particular question? I'm not interested if I may, how I may be able to challenge it. Is it yes or no? Is it fair for them to make a claim against me I cannot challenge?
But you can't challenge it. So your question is ridiculous.
Of course it is. So you can't. Is it fair? See, I think if you were being honest here, when someone says a general question like that, is it fair to allow a litigant to make a claim that cannot be challenged? It would be like, well, no, due process doesn't allow that. That's not fair. If a claim's being used against you, due process requires notice and opportunity to defend. Even basic principles of logic, right and wrong. You have to be able to defend yourself. I mean, but you, instead of just answering the question 3 times, you dodge it. So just answer I'm trying to get to whether these proceedings are fair and why I do the things I do 90% of the time, as you say. But every time I start getting to the heart of it, you just refuse to answer and then accuse me, well, I spoke it in English and you just don't pay attention and you don't understand. But you didn't answer a simple yes or no I can't get out of you. I mean, come on. Jeez.
Well, let's look at it this way. When the conversation was talking about tax agents and cops and things like that. And then I was giving you specific answers to that scenario that you had painted. But now you said, oh, I'm making a general statement. You didn't start out saying, now, hey, come on, man, this isn't your show. You can't demand yes or no answers from me. Who do you think you are? You haven't answered any of my questions directly either, son. So let's move on here.
Look, I've had about enough.
The bottom line is that the evidence that they rely upon to say that it all applies to you is the law that is written on the book that they have to follow. That's the evidence. You can rebut that if you can. You have the opportunity. You've tried. And so your characterization that they're saying something or presenting an argument in a traffic court or in a tax case, that they're bringing something out that you can't rebut, that's a false statement.
Well, I was very direct, and we had gotten to a certain point, and I'm not demanding. I'm just having a conversation with you, so you don't have to condescend to me and call me son. All right? I've called you sir. So apparently that's, respect is not a mutual thing with you. And I understand that. I get it. But I asked you professionally 3 times so that we could stay on that particular issue before we moved on. And you refused to answer just yes or no. So don't go yelling at me or going apoplectic because you don't like to answer a simple question. Look, I'll put it to you this way with the remaining time that I'm actually going to give you, because I'm more inclined to just hang up because we're not accomplishing anything. And I don't like your condescending attitude towards me at all. But
bless your heart.
All right. I've had just about enough of you. I've made my case. I think you dodge questions. You want to just insult me, and that's fine. So I don't think you've made your case. You've dodged questions. I've got video and audio that will be more than enough proof that you're not truthful, that I did answer your questions, and I answered your questions directly. I didn't just give you long dissertations that had nothing to do with the question, and we've got audio proof of that, so you can just spin things how you want. But before I go, the thing is, if they're going to make a claim, however you want to characterize it, that the Constitution applies just because I'm physically in Arizona, and that's literally the foundation of personal and subject matter jurisdiction, and I can't challenge that as to the facts, because addressing the statute and saying that there's a statute doesn't actually address it, because as all the agents that I've spoken to have reversed themselves, the statute is not evidence that the Constitution applies. So that's not actually proving the case. Okay, do you think that the statute is evidence the Constitution applies?
Evidence the Constitution applies at the level you're talking about.
Oh my gosh! I can't get
okay, never mind.
Look, I'm done. I'm done.
Told.
I'm done with this guy. I'm going to wrap things up here.
Can't handle it.
I can handle it.
Face it. He can't face simple questions that are contrary to what he believes or what he sells.
I've answered your questions. You're the one who's dodging them, sir. You're the one. And so you can scream and cry and insult me all you want, but I am the one who addressed the questions, and we have evidence of that. Guys, I've had just about enough of this guy. Let him rant on his own YouTube channel. But hey, you're still welcome to call into my show, and I will be respectful to you. I will call you sir, and I won't be like son and condescending to you. But I've had just about enough of this. I'm not running from anything. If you're more than welcome to always call into my broadcast, you're more than welcome to do that. And hey, maybe after a week or two, we can try this again. But for right now, I've had just about enough that I can take of you. So that's why I'm going to cut it here.